A number of years ago, we started adding borders to our quilts when our customers needed their quilt to be larger. We found ourselves making more and more quilts with borders, yet we were not charging anything extra for the additional work. So I decided to offer a border option at an increased price. To figure out which borders I wanted to offer, I went through all my photographs and chose the ones that I liked the best. Here are the major types of borders we offer. Borders are typically made from t-shirt material. It takes a lot of experience to sew and long-arm quilt a border made from cotton. I would suggest that you make your first 100 to 200 borders out of t-shirt material. You can get t-shirt material at Walmart or other discount stores. You can look online on eBay. Sometimes you can find blank shirts. I like to find mine wherever I can. I found all these shirts at a garage sale. They were trying to get rid of them all, and I bought them all for $1/4 a piece. And it works really great. If I need red, I have red. I would suggest that you don't buy t-shirt material by the yard. You can purchase it, but it's actually a much different material than your actual t-shirt. So don't do that. Try to find actual t-shirts to work from. Fabrics you don't want to use is the Microtech shirts. It's just too flimsy. When we design a border and cut the strips for the border, we're not cutting strips that go from one side of the quilt to the other side. We're actually cutting individual pieces that are equal the size of the block they're next to. For example, on this quilt, this block is 16 by 16. The border piece that goes with this quilt is from here to here. It's 16 inches. And it goes from here to here. This is 16 inches. This is a 12-inch block, 12 inches on this piece also. Corner is a 4-inch by 4-inch piece on this quilt. When you're cutting your blocks, think about the direction of the grain on your blocks that you're cutting. The grain on this block needs to go vertical. So this needs to be a 4 by 16-inch block. The grain on this block also needs to be vertical. So this block needs to be a 16 by 4. So this is 16 by 4 and this is 4 by 16. It's very important to remember this when you're cutting out the blocks for your border. Our quilts are built with that underlying 4-inch grid. When you make your border, it's also going to be on that 4-inch grid. So this block is using the same grid as the inside of the quilt. The only time that this is different is if you use a 2-inch border. A 2-inch border, the blocks are the same length or width as your underlying blocks, but they're only going to be 2 inches. So remember, when you cut out your 2-inch borders, that they actually need to be cut out at 2.5 inches. That's that seam allowance that you can't forget. Designing a border is done while you're laying out your quilt. After you've printed out your map, you need to next make a cutting list. First step is to figure out where your seams will be. So I simply go and draw in each seam corresponding with the underlying block. All right, so next I'm going to do a count. So I'm going to start with my 2-inch border here. This block will be 12 inches wide by 2.5 inches tall. So I write down 12 by 2, and then I count how many I have. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those. On the bottom I have one block right here that will be a 8 wide by 2 tall. This block is 24, so I'm going to have a 24-inch by 2-inch tall. I also will have one block in each corner, which will be 2 by 2, so I'll have 4 of those. Now I'm going to do the opposite side. I'm going to figure out how many that I have that are 2 inches by 12 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4 of those. Now I have 2 inches by 8 inches. 2 by 8s. 1, 2, 3. I have a 2 by 16. 1, 2 of those. And then I have I actually have 3 because this is 16 right there. So I have 3 of those. And that's all the blocks I have for the 2 inches. And then you could do the same thing with the 4-inch blocks. One of the things to remember is right here, this is 12 inches. But this is larger than 12 inches because you have this 2-inch block here. So this block is actually 14 inches. this block is also 14 inches. So you've got this 12 plus this 2. I have a 14-inch block here, and then I have this long block here. So then I'm going to start counting. I got 16 plus 2 is 18, and this is a 16 plus 2, which is also be an 18. So then I count all those blocks, and then I again go back in and count the other 4-inch blocks that I have, and I make myself a cutting list. That way I can cut exactly how many blocks I need of each size. You'll follow this procedure with any style of border you design. I'm cutting blocks for this little sampler quilt. These blocks here are 8 inches by 8 inches. I have a 2-inch border that I've added to that. So this block is 2.5 by 8.5. This block is 2.5 by 2.5. Now I need to cut the blocks that go here. So like over here. So this size needs to be 8 plus 2, which is 10. So this needs to be a 10-inch block that's 4 inches wide. So I've got my fabric here. I'm going to start with my 4-inch template. And I'm going to cut off 4.5 inches. But you can see if it's by 12 that it's going to be too long. So this needs to be 10 inches. So I've got the grain going up and down. And then I'm going to use my ruler and cut off 10 inches. So there's 10. There's my 1/2 inch. And that block fits there. I'm going to cut one more. Again, this is a 10-inch block. I'll cut off a 4-inch strip that's 12 inches long. Use the templates I have. That gets my width. And again, to get my length, I take 10 inches. And then I'm going to use my ruler and cut off 10 inches. It has a 1/2 inch seam allowance there built into the ruler. And that block goes right there. Once you have your border pieces cut, you have 2 options. One, you can just stack them up inside your box all in a nice big stack and work from this stack as you sew them onto your quilt. The other option would be to break your quilt into sewing sections and include those pieces in the sewing sections. For example, on this little sampler quilt here, let's say we have a sewing section right here. So I would take the pieces that I cut for my border and add them into the sewing sections and roll them up together. So it depends on how you like to work. Before we talk about how to sew the border onto your quilt, let's do a quick review. Remember when you're sewing t-shirt material that you want to sew horizontal seams first and then the vertical seams second. This is because it lets your seams nest with each other. So let's quickly look at that again. So I'm going to sew my 2 horizontal seams real quick here. Now we are going to put these together and they'll nest together. So you see how they nest together there. That's how you get a perfect 4 corners, is to have your seams nested. One seam will go up and one seam will go down. And there's a perfect 4 corner. So keep this in mind so when you apply this to your borders that you get perfect corners. Because when you do borders, you will have a lot of 4 corners where the pieces meet up. Let's look at this example. This is a quilt that's a simple 8 by 8. This is a field. This is a double border. So there's a 2-inch border and then a 4-inch border. So how would we sew this together? Well, remember, we want to sew in columns. So I would break this apart. I'd begin by sewing this column, this column, this column, and that column. Then I would sew these 2 together and those 2 together. Then I would take this piece and sew it onto those, like that. Then I would sew this whole column here, and then I would sew these 2 outside columns, and then sew them on last. You're going to get the best looking seams if you do it that way. I know it's complex and takes a lot of thinking, but if you do it wrong, it's not the end of the world. Just continue sewing and watch your corners, make sure they turn out really nice. The more complex the border, the more careful you'll need to be when you're cutting and adding the border to your quilt. A complex border can add hours onto your sewing time. The more complex borders are those where you're adding a 2-inch and a 4-inch border together. Pay attention to the math when you're cutting, and pay attention to which blocks are sewn to which blocks. I've had many people ask me, can I just use the temporary binding for the border? My answer is no. One of the problems with using a temporary binding for the border is we haven't measured the temporary binding when we put it on. So when it's cut off, it's still going to have lots of ruffles in it. The temporary binding will be wavy and it won't lay flat when you put a binding on it. So I'd suggest not using a temporary binding as a border. If your quilt has a border, you do want to put a temporary binding on it. This will keep the border from stretching out, and it also give you a place to pin your quilt at the top and bottom, and it also give you room along the side if you need to check your stitch. So I suggest always using a temporary binding when you use a border.